History buffs of Reddit, what is one of the most fascinating stories you've learned that no one seems to talk about and can't be found in textbooks? Something I read long ago on Reddit, and have saved to my mostly dead other username. During World War II, the Japanese outfitted special planes, some were designed to be launched from submarines, with enough range to reach the west coast of the United States. The goal was to use incendiary bombs to start wildfires in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. One pilot, Nobu Fujita, successfully dropped his bombs over the forest near Brookings, Oregon. Fortunately, a storm the night before had dampened the forest, and the fire started by Fujita's bomb was quickly controlled by the Forest Service. 18 years later, in 1962, Fujita returned to Brookings. He brought with him his family's heirloom, a katana that was over 400 years old. Fujita apologized to the townspeople for his actions during the war, and revealed that if the townspeople demanded it, he would ceremoniously kill himself, commit seppuku, with the sword to make reparations for his actions. The townspeople would have none of it. Fujita was made an honorary citizen of the town and returned to visit it several times during his life, including one trip to plant trees in the forest he had bombed decades before. After his death in 1997, his daughter returned to Brookings and scattered some of his ashes there. The Fujita family katana is on display in Brookings, after being given to the town by Fujita as a token of friendship. I may not be too much of a history buff, but I really like the story of Leo Major. Leo was a Canadian soldier serving in World War II. He was assigned to the division in charge of liberating the Netherlands. One day in the summer of 1944, he was alone on reconnaissance duty when he saw two German soldiers walking nearby. He killed one and captured the other, then captured their commanding officer and an entire German garrison after killing a couple more. He came under fire from other German soldiers and Duarte kept walking. He single-handedly captured 93 German soldiers. In February of 1945, a truck Leo was in hit a landmine. He broke his back, a few ribs, and both ankles, and was told he would be discharged. Leo couldn't give enough fucks, however, and a week later he snuck out of the field hospital he was in and stayed with a Dutch family. After getting better he made it back into his battalion and volunteered to do reconnaissance of the city of Zwolle. Once he departed, he decided to take the city himself. He convinced a German soldier to relay a message back to the German army, then through the night ran around the town making all the noise he could. He shot bullets, threw grenades, captured German soldiers, burned down the Gestapo, and cleaned out the SS building in Zwolle. His tactics were so effective he convinced the German army that the entire Canadian army was invading the town, so by the morning the town was free of Germans and the Canadian army just marched in. He has a street named after him in that town now. Diarrhea was so widespread and common in the 19th century that people would develop opium habits because opium makes you constipated. Edit, well that escalated quickly. As for the exact diseases and reasons that people had diarrhea, I can only say that the 19th century was gross and nobody knew proper sanitary practices. I'm glad you guys all enjoyed debating Imodium until Imodium is made from opiates. If you want to learn more about opium, diarrhea or the combination of the two, then Google it because I'm busy and Google has better resources than I. Thanks for upvoting everyone. I've told this story before, but it never fails to amuse me. Strap in, boys and girls, it's time to learn about the time in pre-revolutionary France where bleeding from your anus was a fashion statement. In early 1685, King Louis XIV of France developed a fistula, a small channel near his anus, resulting in great pain. Fistulas, much like the Wu-Tang Clan, ain't nothing to fuck with. Eventually the pain got so bad that he couldn't ride a horse, sit for long periods, which is kind of important when you're a king, or even make a bowel movement without regretting it immensely. The normal remedies were applied, enemas and poultices from morning until night, with zero effect. Louis decided, you know what? Fuck it. Let's go down the surgical route. Unfortunately for Louis, at the time there was no surgical route. He hired a surgeon barber named Charles François Felix and asked him to fix him. Not entirely stupid and not willing to risk fucking up a novel surgery on the King of France, Felix requested 6 months to practice, which he did on prisoners. Live prisoners. Live, healthy prisoners, sometimes as many as 4 a week, in an era where antiseptics and anesthetics didn't exist. The success rates were about as you'd imagine, although at least some of the prisoners survived, and eventually Felix felt confident enough to perform the surgery on the king. And it worked. Within 3 months, the king was riding his horse like nothing had happened, and Felix was the talk of the town. People were desperate to emulate the king so badly that people who were entirely healthy would pay Felix to perform the surgery on them, and those less willing to suffer, or at least less willing to pay, would fake having the surgery, wearing bandages known as la royale to mimic the king and pretend that they too were cool and with it, even though with it meant suffering from a painful condition of the anus. 1014 AD, after defeating a large Bulgarian army at the Battle of Clydian, Byzantine Emperor Basil II had 99 of every 100 prisoners blinded, leaving each 100th man with one eye so that he could lead his comrades home. Upon seeing his thousands of blinded soldiers, the Bulgarian emperor reportedly died of a heart attack. Basil II was known thereafter as Basil Bulgar Slayer. Basil II was quite the badass, his excessive cruelty toward the Bulgarians notwithstanding. Stout and hardy, he showed no love for the finery and regalia of his office but preferred to conduct meetings in military uniform. He was quite capable on horseback, well liked by the peasantry, and trusted by his soldiers. And he worked tirelessly to curb the excesses of the aristocracy and fortify his realm against aggressors. If his successors had followed his example, Manzikert might not have happened. And history might be a little bit different. He was also the emperor responsible for organizing the Varangian Guard, an elite crack infantry regiment consisting, initially, almost entirely of Scandinavians and the emperor's personal bodyguards. They would march directly behind him at processions and accompany him on campaigns, and their leader, the Akolauthos or follower, would have been something like a secret service agent, following the emperor almost everywhere. They had quite the reputation as the emperor's winebags. Popular myth has it that the Varangians, as people of Germanic descent were known to the Byzantines, were renowned for how seriously they took their oaths, but they were also paid very well. On campaigns, 1/3 of the spoils would be reserved for these axe-wielding barbarians. The term Pelikai Barbaroi shows up often and may be a reference to the Danish axe, with another third for the emperor and the remaining third for both the native and foreign components of the military. The Varangians had a tradition of service to the emperor even before Basil. Their loyalty to the throne was renowned, though it's worth noting that their loyalty was in principle to the office of emperor, not the emperor himself. Legend has it that when they discovered the slain body of the emperor Nikephoros II, they shrugged their shoulders and swore fealty to the new emperor, his murderer, Ioannis Zimisks, Basil II's predecessor. As John Julius Norwich put it, alive, they would have fought for him to the last breath. Dead, there was no point avenging him. They had a new master now. Sometimes, though, they could be weaponized by a usurper seeking to stage a coup. No one is incorruptible. The most famous Varangian was probably Harald Sigurdsson, known to most as Harald Hardrada, Har-Oda. Yes, that Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway who was killed at Stamford Bridge in 1066. Had previously spent time as a warrior in Greece, as the Scandinavians called the lands of the Eastern Roman Empire, and fought in campaigns throughout the Mediterranean. Following the Norman conquest of England, dispossessed Anglo-Saxon warriors even joined the guard and flocked to Constantinople in groups. So even in the 11th century, you would have been able to hear English, albeit an unrecognizable form of English, on the streets of the Queen of Cities. The main incident in World War II. American submarines were very good at getting away from Japanese surface ships. This was because the Japanese thought American submarines could only reach a much shallower depth than they actually could, and they never set their depth charges to these deeper depths. Congressman Andrew May decided it would be a good idea to hold a press conference announcing this fact. From then on the Japanese set their depth charges to these deeper depths. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the U.S. submarine fleet in the Pacific, estimated that May's security breach cost the United States Navy as many as 10 submarines and 800 crewmen killed in action. He said, "I hear Congressman May said the Jap depth charges are not set deep enough. He would be pleased to know that the Japs set them deeper now. Loose lips sink ships." In World War II, there was a Spanish spy named Joan Puyol Garcia who approached the Allies to work for them. When they refused, he approached the Nazis, and they accepted him, giving him the codename Arabelle. Once he earned credentials working as a Nazi spy, he approached the Allies again, this time getting a job as a double agent, codenamed Garbo. This is where it gets unbelievable. He fed the Germans a combination of misinformation, true but useless information, and high-value information that always got to the Germans just a little too late. He even started a spy network consisting of 27 sub-agents of his own. Keep in mind that not a single one of these sub-agents existed. They were completely imaginary, but regardless, he submitted expense reports for them and had the Nazis giving him money to pay their salaries. At one point, when he had to explain why some high-value information got to the Germans late, he told them that one of his spies had died. He actually got the Germans to pay the imaginary spy's imaginary wife a very real pension for her loss. Not only did his false information get the Nazis to waste millions of dollars, but he was also instrumental in convincing the Nazis that the attacks on D-Day were just a diversion. And the real attack was yet to come, keeping vital German resources away from the front lines. He is one of the only people to ever get an Iron Cross from the Germans, which required Hitler's personal authorization, since he wasn't a soldier, and from King George VI. Not that it can't be found in a textbook, but it is never talked about in the US unless you take very niche university courses, the history of modern Greece. Basically at war with foreign entities or themselves constantly between 1910 to 1986. Two different fascist regimes, thwarted communist uprisings, the expulsion of a king, and the return of the king like 3 times before being kicked off for good. Larger-than-life political figures such as Venizelos and Papandreou. Essentially the fighting around World War I started with the First Balkan War against the Ottomans in 1912 and didn't end until 1922 when they were defeated in Anatolia by Ataturk's army. The end of this fighting led to the League of Nations decreeing that all Muslims in Greece must migrate to Turkey and all Christians in Turkey to Greece. As you can imagine, this started a lot more turmoil in the smaller nation, as it was forced to bring in about 35% of their population's worth of people in refugees that didn't speak their language. That was just the beginning and I could go on and on, but who knows if anyone will read this. The Aroostook War. Dumbest fucking war in history. Fought essentially between Maine and New Brunswick between 1837 to 1840-ish, to claim that Great Britain and the USA were actually involved would be a stretch, over the northern border of Maine. Basically it was a war between lumberjacks and townspeople on both sides of the border. It resulted in more arrests than actual casualties. Somehow Free French Canadians got involved too, although I've never been able to figure out what they were pissed off about. At one point the British provincial police had to step in and stop the fighting. After 3 years this clusterfuck was stopped by London and Washington when it became obvious that it was affecting trade for both countries and doing nothing but costing everyone money. Edit 1. Okay, I know about the emu and pig wars and admit they are pretty stupid. The reason I think this is the dumbest is for reasons you don't usually see in the textbooks. It's like something out of a Monty Python movie. Battles broken up by animal attacks. A militia so awesome in its war-making abilities that it abandoned a fort over a woman taking a hike in the woods and got arrested by British authorities when it went into battle. Nobody at the time even knew which side the French Canadians were on. And, hardly mentioned by anyone because no one really cared, but there were Indians in the area. They were annoyed because there was logging going on and they were caught in the crossfire. So they did what Indians do best, hit and run raids on everybody. Which both sides blamed on each other. But the dumbest thing, one great and one up-and-coming world power let this drag on for 3 years before doing something about it. This link does a pretty good job of summing this war up. More people may know about this now compared to if you had posted this question like 6 months ago, but the story of the Clotilda, the last slave ship to carry slaves from Africa to the US. The importation of slaves into the US had been outlawed by the federal government in 1808, but the international slave trade was still active. In 1859, the captain of the ship bet a rich man that he could import some slaves from Africa. He sailed that year and made it back, smuggled them into port at night, took them up the river and then transferred them to a steamship and burnt the Clotilda. The slaves were split according to the people who fronted the money for the captain to sail and were enslaved alongside the American-born slaves and were freed after the Civil War. The captain was tried, but not convicted. The slaves settled on recovered land and founded a town called Africatown that's still there. It got launched back into the news recently because there's been a lot of attempts to find the last US slave ship and people believe that they found it a few months ago.